The paper is thin and gray, already curling at the edges from damp air and too many fingers. A cash register spits it out with a dry cough. The ink is uneven, like the machine is tired. On the line for laundry powder, the receipt says one thing, 10 rubles. The box in the buyer's hand says another. Molded into the cardboard in official, obedient type, 62 kopecks. The cashier doesn't look up. She has seen this fight 1,000 times. The buyer stares at the two numbers that are not supposed to exist in the same universe, and yet here they are, side by side, on one transaction in Moscow in late 1989. A woman behind him mutters, not quietly, that the state has lost its mind. A man in a worn coat snorts that the state never had one. Someone laughs, sharp and joyless, because laughter is cheaper than soap now. This is what the Soviet economy looked like at the end. Not a grand speech, not a parade, not even a tank. A receipt. A small piece of paper that accidentally tells the truth. The truth is that the Soviet Union had two prices for almost everything. One was the official state price, a number chosen by committees, decrees, and ideology. The other was the real price, the one whispered, traded, and finally shouted out loud when the system began to crack. The receipt is the crack made visible. The official price was a story the state told itself. A proud story. A moral story. The idea was simple. If the government controlled production and controlled distribution, then it could control prices. No inflation, no chaos, no greedy merchants, just stable numbers and obedient goods. So the numbers were frozen. Bread for kopecks, milk for kopecks, soap for kopecks. Decades of printed prices, often literally stamped onto the product at the factory, as if the ink itself could overpower reality. But reality always bills you, eventually. By the 1980s, the Soviet state was paying people more money while producing fewer things worth buying. Wages went up, bonuses multiplied, ministries fought for bigger budgets. The machine kept turning, and each revolution of that machine minted more rubles. Rubles poured into pockets. Goods did not pour onto shelves. That difference did not show up as inflation in the official statistics because prices were not allowed to move. Instead, it showed up as absence, as queues, as the smell of stale cabbage in stairwells, because people stored food anywhere they could. In the Soviet Union, inflation wore a disguise. It stood in line, visual. Archival footage of a winter queue in Moscow, people stamping feet, faces blank, a truck unloading boxes as if delivering rations. In a normal economy, rising demand pulls prices up. In the Soviet economy, rising demand pulled shelves down to bare wood. The state could command prices, but it could not command physics. You cannot buy what does not exist. The planners had built a system that treated prices like commandments, not signals. Prices were not supposed to communicate scarcity. They were supposed to communicate virtue. Cheap bread meant the state cared. Cheap rent meant the state was just. Cheap public transport meant the state was modern. It also meant the state was bleeding. When a loaf of bread costs less than it costs to make, somebody pays the difference. In the Soviet Union, that somebody was the budget. The state subsidized essentials so heavily that the official prices became ceremonial. The number on the tag was a political slogan printed in kopecks. Those subsidies were survivable when the country still had slack, when oil revenues were strong, when the empire could borrow against tomorrow. By late 1989, tomorrow was already mortgaged, and the public knew it, even if the ministers pretended not to. The shelves told them. Soap powder became a small tragedy because it sat at the intersection of everything the Soviet system couldn't admit. Production bottlenecks, transport failures, procurement corruption, and a currency that was no longer connected to value. Detergent is not complicated. It is chemicals, packaging, logistics. Yet Moscow stores ran short of it for months, not because the Soviet Union forgot how to make detergent, but because the system forgot how to make incentives. If a factory meets a quota by shipping detergent at a fixed price that doesn't cover costs, it learns a simple lesson: produce less, hide more, trade sideways. If a warehouse manager can divert a pallet to a friend and receive cash, favors, or a television set in return, the warehouse learns a simpler lesson: the plan is optional. The official price is what the state says it should cost. The real price is what it costs to get it. The Soviet Union did not collapse because its people suddenly stopped believing in communism. Many were tired, many were cynical, many were still loyal. It collapsed because too many people, at too many points in the economy, started behaving as if the official prices were fiction. Because they were. For years, the second price lived in the shadows. It had names, jokes, codes. It lived in the back of markets, in stairwells, in the pockets of taxi drivers, in the hands of speculators with nervous eyes. It also lived in the most Soviet of inventions: connections. If you had the right cousin, the right neighbor, the right colleague, you didn't pay with money at all. You paid with obligation. That system had a price too. It just wasn't printed. Then, in the late 1980s, the state made a decision that sounded like reform and acted like an accelerant. It legalized a form of private enterprise: cooperatives. Visual: newspaper headlines announcing new cooperative laws, archival shots of newly opened co-op cafes with handwritten menus. The cooperative was supposed to be the compromise, not capitalism, not quite. A small island of initiative inside a sea of state ownership. People could open cafes, workshops, service businesses. They could fill the gaps that the plan couldn't fill. And, most important of all, they could set prices. That one permission did what propaganda and police never could. It revealed the hidden number underneath the official number. When a cooperative could charge what customers would pay, the cooperative did not charge 62 kopecks for detergent. It charged 10 rubles, or 12, or 15. Whatever the desperate buyer, standing in the empty city, could be pushed into paying. The buyer hated it. The buyer also paid it. Because the alternative was another week of searching, another dozen queues, another day lost to absence. The Soviet state had built a society where time was the real currency. Time spent in line. Time spent bargaining. Time spent calling friends, trading favors, hunting rumors about which store had what. Cooperatives did something obscene and honest. They priced that time. A state store offered detergent for kopecks if it appeared. The cooperative offered it for rubles because it appeared. One price was moral theater. The other was supply. In 1989, those two worlds began colliding in public. The two prices stopped being a whispered secret and became a printed insult. In some places, the insult was edible. Meat was the classic Soviet nightmare. Officially, a kilogram of beef had a state price that suggested abundance. In practice, beef was a holiday, a rumor, or a gray slab handed over after hours of queuing. By 1989, rationing was creeping back in multiple regions. Coupons, stamps, limits. The state tried to pretend it was temporary difficulties. The public understood it as a confession. At the same time, markets, legal farmers markets, and illegal street sales sold meat at many times the official state price. The same cow, two universes. In one universe, the state promised cheap meat for everyone. In the other, the butcher demanded a thick roll of rubles. The absurdity wasn't just the gap. It was the logic behind the gap. The state price wasn't low because the state had made meat cheap. The state price was low because the state had forbidden the price from admitting scarcity. The scarcity still existed. It just moved into the shadow. A price that cannot move does not eliminate shortage. It relocates it. And once the cooperative was legalized, the shortage found a storefront. Cooperative cafes became symbols overnight. Menus with real prices. real coffee, real sausage, real sugar, the kind of place that could serve you a meal without the usual Soviet ritual of apology. And then the bill arrived, and the meal cost a week's wages. A worker could spend a month inside state prices and still not taste meat. A cooperative could offer meat today at a price that made the worker feel like a foreigner in his own city. That sting mattered. The Soviet system had always asked people to sacrifice. It asked them to endure shortages in exchange for dignity and equality. By 1989, it was offering shortages and inequality at the same time. That is not a bargain. That is a swindle. The two-price system spread beyond food into the things people use to measure modern life. Jeans were not just pants. Jeans were a referendum. Jeans were proof that the West could produce something simple that the Soviet Union could not distribute honestly. In state ideology, jeans were trivial. In Soviet streets, jeans were currency. A real imported pair could cost a month's salary or more, depending on the city and the connection. Officially, the Soviet citizen lived in a society without exploitation. In reality, the teenager with the right denim walked like a minor aristocrat. Electronics were worse. A television set might have an official price, printed and smug. But try to buy one in 1989 without waiting months, without being on a list, without bribery, without a friend in a warehouse. Then see what it costs on the side. The real price included the bribe, the favor, the humiliation, the risk. The real price was what people actually paid. Some goods didn't even bother pretending. Foreign goods lived in special hard currency shops where ordinary Soviet money was treated like monopoly paper. You needed dollars, marks, or special vouchers. And suddenly, the same state that swore it had abolished capitalist inequality was operating stores for people with capitalist currency. That was another two-price system, even uglier. One set of shelves for the privileged, one for the masses. But the cooperative price gap was more corrosive because it happened in the same neighborhood, on the same street, sometimes in the same building. A state shop with empty shelves. A cooperative shop next door with full shelves and outrageous prices. The state wasn't even hiding the contradiction anymore. It was renting it out. The cooperatives were not just sellers. They were a pipeline. Here is the trick that made 1989 so lethal. Cooperatives could pull resources out of the state sector. They could buy at official prices, then sell at real prices. They could lease state equipment. They could access state warehouses through friends and bribes. They could use state trucks, state fuel, state premises. They did not need to build a new economy. They could skim the old one. In a sane world, that would be called arbitrage. In the late Soviet world, it was called enterprise. And it worked because the state had created a massive price differential and then opened a door between the two rooms. A cooperative manager did not need to invent detergent. He needed access to a pallet. The official price was an input. The market price was the output. The difference was profit. One box at a time, the Soviet state was being monetized by its own reforms. The public saw the profits first in the body language. In the new restaurants, in the private taxis, in the leather jackets that did not come from Soviet factories. A handful of people began living as if the Soviet Union had already ended. That was not the most important change. The most important change was what happened inside the state enterprises. Directors and managers learned that the planned economy had become a shell game. If you followed the plan, you lost. If you cheated, you survived. If you cheated well, you got rich. A factory could fulfill the plan by delivering a portion of output at official prices, then divert additional output to a cooperative partner for cash. Or it could underdeliver and explain the shortage as a transport issue. Or it could stockpile goods until it could trade them for better terms. The plan became theater, and the directors became actors who also ran the stage crew. All of this was lubricated by the Soviet obsession with paperwork. Forms, stamps, signatures, approvals. The cooperative era did not remove bureaucracy. It gave bureaucracy a price. If a stamp could unlock a warehouse, the stamp became valuable. If a signature could redirect a shipment, the signature became a commodity. The Soviet state, which was supposed to be a unified machine, turned into a market for permissions. Two prices existed not just for goods, but for authority. The cynicism spread fast because it was rational. People were not suddenly immoral. They were adapting to a system that punished honesty and rewarded extraction. The official price was the state's attempt to freeze the world in place. But the world was moving. The Soviet Union had a modern population with modern desires and a modern sense of comparison. People knew what existed elsewhere. They saw it on foreign films, on smuggled magazines, on the clothes of diplomats and sailors. They also knew their own shelves were emptier than ever. That contrast is what made the two prices intolerable. A poor society can survive with honest poverty. A society collapses faster when it sees the lie. In 1989, the lie was printed. It was printed on the detergent box, and it was printed on the receipt. The state price said 62 kopecks because the state needed to believe it could protect the citizen from chaos. The receipt said 10 rubles because the citizen was already living in chaos. The cooperative didn't create the chaos. It simply offered a receipt for it. The grotesque part is that the state still tried to pretend everything was under control while it quietly admitted through policy that it wasn't. Price controls were debated, threatened, applied unevenly. Officials raged about speculators in speeches while their colleagues quietly partnered with them behind closed doors. The Soviet Union loved blaming individuals for systemic failures. It was emotionally satisfying. It was also useless. If detergent sells for 10 rubles in a cooperative, the cooperative is not the main villain. The villain is the state store that cannot keep detergent on the shelf at 62 kopecks because the system cannot produce and distribute enough detergent at that price. Punish the cooperative and you get moral purity and empty shelves. Allow the cooperative and you get full shelves and moral collapse. That was the trap, and the Soviet leadership walked into it because there were no good exits left. For ordinary people, the new pricing reality did not feel like reform. It felt like betrayal. The Soviet social contract had always been brutal, but clear. Accept limits, and the state will at least keep the basics cheap. Now, the basics were not cheap, and they were not even available at the cheap price. The citizen was being asked to accept limits and pay extra for them. That is when the jokes turn bitter. That is when loyalty turns conditional. A mother with a child does not care about theory. She cares about butter. If butter exists only in a cooperative at a price that drains the family budget, she does not call it marketization. She calls it theft. And sometimes she isn't wrong. Because the cooperative price often included a hidden crime, state goods resold for private gain. This is where the receipt becomes more than an insult. It becomes evidence. A box of detergent priced at 62 kopecks was manufactured, transported, and stored under state systems. It was meant to be sold as part of a public distribution network. When it is sold for 10 rubles, someone has captured the difference. That difference is the extraction of state value into private hands. Scale it up from detergent to meat, to fuel, to building materials, to machinery, to export goods. And you begin to see how the Soviet Union did not simply collapse. It was hollowed out. This hollowing had a rhythm. It happened through leases, joint ventures, cooperative partnerships, and creative accounting. State enterprises began acting like private firms without the legal framework of private responsibility. The risks stayed public. The gains became personal. A director could sell output to the state for official prices and still be a loyal planner on paper. He could also divert the best output to a cooperative that paid him back through side channels. He could keep the worst output for the plan and the best output for the profit. The planned economy became a dumping ground for leftovers. At the same time, the money inside the system kept swelling. Rubles in bank accounts, rubles under mattresses, rubles chasing a shrinking pool of goods. The more money chased fewer goods, the more desperate people became. The more desperate people became, the more they paid. The more they paid, the more profitable extraction became. The more profitable extraction became, the more goods were diverted from the state sector. The more goods were diverted, the emptier the state shelves became. A feedback loop, accelerating. The official prices kept whispering that everything was fine. The real prices kept screaming that nothing was. The Soviet state had once used control to suppress the market. By 1989, control was being used to ration humiliation. And because the market was now partially legal, the humiliation came with receipts. People talk about the collapse as if it was sudden. It wasn't. It was a slow exposure. The two-price system exposed the central lie. The state did not set prices because it understood value. It set prices because it feared value. Value is chaotic. Value admits scarcity. Value admits failure. The Soviet project could not admit failure without dissolving its moral authority. So it denied. It froze. It issued decrees. And then, in the end, it legalized a mechanism that made denial impossible. A cooperative price is not a philosophical statement. It is a number set by a seller who has goods and a buyer who wants them. It is the simplest transaction in human history. That simplicity is what made it so lethal to a system built on controlled complexity. When citizens saw detergent sold for 10 rubles while the state insisted it was worth 62 kopecks, they learned something no textbook needed to teach. The official ruble was not real. It was an accounting unit, a permission slip, a narrative device. The real ruble was the one that could turn into meat, shoes, medicine, spare parts. The real ruble was the one that worked in the cooperative and the market, not on the propaganda poster. Once people understand their money is fake, they stop behaving like citizens and start behaving like survivors. That shift happened everywhere at once. Hoarding, barter, panic buying, selling household items, trading anything for anything. The economy reverted to older instincts because the modern system stopped delivering. And the state, watching this, did what failing states do. It tried to control harder. It threatened price caps. It raided markets. It blamed speculators. It issued moral lectures. It arrested small-time traders while the larger extraction continued behind ministerial doors. The spectacle was comforting to nobody. When the Soviet Union finally began lifting some official prices, it did not restore trust. It confirmed the lie had ended. People heard price reform and understood the state is admitting what the receipt already proved. And once that admission arrives, the saved rubles become a stampede. Everyone tries to convert paper into goods, goods into safer paper into foreign currency into an exit. The two prices become 3, then 10, then chaos. By the last year, the official numbers were so worthless that they became a kind of dark poetry. Salaries rose while shelves emptied faster. People received more rubles and lived poorer. The planned economy had promised to eliminate capitalist crises. Instead, it produced its own kind of crisis. A collapse not driven by prices rising in shops, but by reality rising outside them, until the shop price became a joke. The detergent receipt is not famous because detergent is important. It's famous because it's clean evidence. It shows the exact moment when ideology and arithmetic stopped agreeing. The Soviet Union could survive cynicism. It could survive jokes. It could survive shortages for a while, because people could still tell themselves that sacrifice had meaning. It could not survive a receipt that said the sacrifice was being sold to them at a markup. Two prices meant two moral systems. The official price belonged to a world of slogans, equality, and planned abundance. The real price belonged to a world of scarcity, privilege, and extraction. In 1989, those worlds were both real, both visible, and both incompatible. The state had tried to keep them separated, official life in the foreground, unofficial life in the shadows. But once cooperatives dragged the shadow price into the light, everyone could see the scaffolding. A stage looks impressive until you see the ropes. The Soviet collapse was not just political. It was a collapse of measurement. The state could no longer measure value honestly, and without honest measurement, a modern economy is blind. Blind economies do not glide into the future. They stumble, they lurch, and they fall. The last scene is not heroic. It is ordinary. A man folds the receipt and stuffs it into his pocket, not because he plans to return anything, but because paper matters when everything else disappears. He walks out into the gray Moscow street carrying a box of detergent that his government claims is worth 62 kopecks. He paid 10 rubles because that is what the world demanded. He did not vote on that world. He did not debate it. He simply adapted to it, the way millions did, until adaptation became a mass verdict. That receipt does not just record a purchase. It records the price of pretending. And the final price of pretending in the Soviet Union was the Soviet Union.